When I was growing up, I played a lot of different card and video games, and I don't know about you guys, but none of them gave me as many trust issues as old school Yu-Gi-Oh did. A young Dzeeff would sit there debating about whether or not to attack into my opponent's back row, and then I would attack after they said, "Oh, don't worry, I have nothing," and then they would flip up a Mirror Force to destroy all of my attack position monsters. Back in the day, there were a lot of trust issue cards that I wanted to talk about in today's video. And I'm not doing this just to take a trip down memory lane, although we will be doing that a little bit at least, but I also want to compare new school Yu-Gi-Oh to old school Yu-Gi-Oh and talk about where these types of moments might appear in newer school games. Obviously, Yu-Gi-Oh has changed a lot over the years, but I think these sorts of situations are still present even in modern day gameplay. For me at least, when I think about cards that gave me trust issues, I think about cards that had a level of uncertainty to them and that had a level of unlikeliness to them. So what do I mean by that? Well, they're cards that usually you wouldn't know your opponent had. You know, they're cards that either they kept in their hand until they were ready to be used, or they were cards that were set face down but you couldn't figure out what they were. In terms of unlikeliness, I think one of the things that was around a lot more with old school Yu-Gi-Oh decks was that people would play decks where like almost the entire deck was made up of one-ofs of very powerful cards. So it was pretty hard to narrow down whether or not your opponent had a Mirror Force, because not only would it be face down on the board where you couldn't see it, but also they only had one copy in their deck. So it was pretty unlikely for them to have it, but you still had to ask yourself if it was worth playing around that potential one-of, just in case it blew up your entire board. Now I feel like I've already covered Mirror Force quite a bit in this video, so let's talk about a different card that gave me trust issues, Magic Cylinder. These days I do make fun of Magic Cylinder quite a bit. The card is not very good in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, but back in the day it was a real powerhouse. People didn't have decks that were capable of OTKing the opponent nearly as often as they do nowadays, so Magic Cylinder was a way to sometimes close the gap after dealing small amounts of damage to your opponent over the course of many turns. Magic Cylinder was a card that you always had to be prepared for, because if you were at like 2,000 or 2,500 life points, you really didn't want to attack with your bigger monsters because Magic Cylinder might be in your opponent's back row. In a similar way, Ring of Destruction was a fantastic burn card in old school Yu-Gi-Oh that honestly was better than Magic Cylinder in many situations. You didn't have to wait for your opponent to attack, you could target whatever monster you wanted to. Yeah, it wasn't as good if you had low life points as well, but oftentimes you could steal a lot of wins with Ring of Destruction. So I think that those two burn cards existing in Yu-Gi-Oh oftentimes only as one-ofs did cause a lot of trust issues for old school Yu-Gi-Oh players. This happened with monster cards as well. I'm sure every old school player has attacked into a Morphing Jar or a Cyber Jar at least once, but that could happen to anyone because those cards were limited. You didn't want to set your entire hand every single turn just in case your opponent had Morphing Jar, because at that point you would now be playing into cards like Heavy Storm. But let's move past just looking at card effects and talk about how some cards might be played in specific situations. For example, with Heavy Storm, the most common situation would just be your opponent has a few back row cards, so you activate Heavy Storm right from your hand. But if you play those older formats, like if you go back and play GOAT format right now, people oftentimes won't commit more than one or two back row cards at a time unless they're chainable, because they're afraid of losing to Heavy Storm. So what people did back in the day is that they would set their copy of Heavy Storm on the board, and then that opponent would go, "Oh, clearly I'm allowed to set whatever back row cards I want because it seems like they don't have Heavy Storm," so they would set like 3 back row instead of just 1, which would then prompt the other player to flip up their Heavy Storm once their turn rolled around. This was known as the ProSet Heavy, and even to this day you still hear people using that phrase, although I do think when people go back and play GOAT format they might get a little bit over enthusiastic about the ProSet Heavy play. I see people that play GOAT format nowadays oftentimes always going for this play, where the real strength in it from back in the day was that people weren't always doing it. It was a rare case that the best players would sort of seek out to catch their opponent off guard. If you go for a ProSet Heavy every single game, it's not really going to work out in the long run. Now admittedly, this style of Yu-Gi-Oh was not perfect. A lot of people didn't like playing against Saki one-ofs, and competitive players still complain about Saki one-ofs to this day. People complain about cards like Called by the Grave and Imperial Order, not only because of how powerful they are, but also because they're one-ofs, so you don't really necessarily always want to play around it, but if your opponent has one of those cards and you didn't play around it, they'll probably be able to win that game. But I want to shift focus here a little bit and talk about some areas where modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Still has these uncertain situations. For example, I think hand traps actually do carry on this style of Yu-Gi-Oh! Even in modern day times, and I know that a lot of old school players don't like hand traps, and I get that, but that's kind of an entirely different discussion for another day. I think what matters now for this video is that hand traps are very popular, but also your opponent doesn't really know what hand traps you have in your hand, or even what hand traps you're playing in that current tournament. And I think that does add this level of uncertainty that's very similar to those old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Days. Now, hand traps are obviously very different than regular trap cards. Usually when we're talking about hand traps, we're talking about cards that you can use from your hand on your opponent's turn, cards like Ash Blossom and Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence and so many more. Now, of course, there is a pretty big difference between setting a copy of Mirror Force or Magic Cylinder versus just discarding a copy of Ash Blossom out of your hand. But I do think in terms of uncertainty that hand traps aren't that far from those older trap cards that we didn't like playing around back in the day. Beyond that though, Backrow cards still play a role in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! When a combo deck combos off on turn 1 and then sets a Backrow card, you don't know if it's an Infinite Impermanence that they drew going first that could potentially negate one of your effects, or if it's just a random spell card that they didn't really need that they're setting as a bluff to make you think that they have more interruptions than they actually do. Now obviously Infinite Impermanence is a hand trap, and I'm using an example where a combo deck that might not play regular traps might draw Impermanence when going first, but also keep in mind that there are a lot of Backrow decks in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that play older cards like Torrential Tribute and Solemn Judgment alongside newer cards like Ice Dragon's Prison and Solemn Strike. And when you play against those decks, sometimes it does feel like old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Where they have 4 Backrow cards and you don't know which Backrow cards to play around. So these things do still come up in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Even if Backrow cards in general aren't as common as they were 20 years ago. And I think it's important to mention here that I think this level of interaction on your opponent's turn, this uncertainty from the other player's perspective, is one of the things that makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Unique. I've played games like Pokemon and Hearthstone where for the most part you don't interact with your opponent on their turn. Hearthstone does have secrets, but those trigger whenever their requirements are met. You don't actually get to choose when you use their abilities, they just happen automatically. So while that is an interaction on the opponent's turn, it's not quite the same as deciding if you want to use a Mirror Force or a Magic Cylinder on an opponent's attack. Even though the game has changed a lot over the years, I still think there are elements of new school Yu-Gi-Oh! That were present way back in the day, even if nowadays they look pretty different. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is always evolving. We get new cards, we get new ban lists, we get new mechanics, we get new rulings, so the game is not going to look the same as it did 20 years ago. But I do still think we can find elements of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! In new school Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think that's always fun to discuss. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I'll see you later. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.